The town pushed the obese girl aside, but the mountain man chose to walk beside her, silently. The town of Harrow's Creek sat nestled in a valley where the Appalachian foothills began their ascent toward the wild mountain country beyond. In the autumn of 1793, it was a settlement of rough-hewn log cabins, a trading post, a blacksmith's forge, and a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays. The population numbered perhaps 200 souls, most of them farmers and trappers, scratching out an existence on the edge of civilization. Among them lived Clara Witmore, a girl of 19, who had become the subject of whispers and sidelong glances. She had always been large, even as a child, but in recent years her frame had expanded considerably. Her father, a wheelwright who had died 2 winters past, had left her and her ailing mother with little more than their cabin and a small plot of land. Clara worked tirelessly to provide for them both, taking in washing, mending clothes, and doing whatever labor she could find. But the town had no kindness for her. Women tutted and pulled their skirts aside when she passed. Children, emboldened by their parents' disdain, would sometimes throw pebbles and call her names. The young men of the settlement made cruel jokes about her size, and even the minister's wife had once declared publicly that gluttony was a sin that manifested itself in the flesh. Clara bore it all in silence. She had learned long ago that defending herself only brought more ridicule. Instead, she kept her eyes down, spoke only when necessary, and tried to make herself as invisible as a woman of her size could be. On a crisp October morning, Clara walked to the trading post to purchase cornmeal and salt with the few coins she had earned from her washing. The proprietor, Mr. Hutchins, barely acknowledged her presence, sliding the goods across the counter with a grimace as though proximity to her might somehow contaminate him. As Clara gathered her purchases, she heard the familiar sound of laughter behind her. A group of young women her age had entered, daughters of the more prosperous families in town. They wore clean dresses and had ribbons in their hair. "Oh, my," one of them said loudly, "I do hope there's enough cornmeal left for the rest of us. Some people seem to require so much more than their share." The others giggled. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she said nothing. She tucked her packages under her arm and moved toward the door. "Clara," another voice called out mockingly, "aren't you going to buy some sugar? I heard it's your favorite." More laughter. Clara pushed through the door and stepped into the autumn sunshine, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. She had cried enough over the years. Now she simply endured. Elijah Stone was a legend in the mountains, though few in Harrow's Creek knew much about him beyond rumors and speculation. He was said to be a trapper of extraordinary skill, a man who could track a deer through a snowstorm and survive weeks in the wilderness with nothing but his knife and his wits. Some claimed he was running from something in his past. Others said he simply preferred the company of wolves to the company of men. The truth, as is often the case, was more complicated. Elijah had come to the mountains 5 years earlier, after the death of his wife and infant son from fever. They had been settling in a small community in Virginia when sickness swept through like wildfire. Within a week, he had buried them both. The grief had been so consuming, so absolute, that Elijah had walked away from everything he knew and disappeared into the wilderness. In the mountains, he had found a kind of peace, not happiness exactly, but a quietness that made the pain bearable. He built a cabin in a remote valley, trapped beaver and fox, hunted deer and elk, and lived a solitary existence interrupted only by occasional trips to Harrow's Creek to trade his pelts for supplies. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and powerful, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a thick beard. His eyes were gray like storm clouds and carried a sadness that he could never quite conceal. He spoke little, moved with the silent grace of a predator, and had a reputation for fairness in his dealings. On that same October morning, Elijah arrived in Harrow's Creek with a pack horse laden with furs. He had spent the summer months deep in the high country and had amassed a good collection of pelts that would fetch a fair price. As he led his horse down the main street, he noticed the usual wariness in the townspeople's eyes. They didn't trust him, this silent mountain man who appeared like a ghost and disappeared just as quickly. He tied his horse outside the trading post and was about to enter when he saw a young woman emerge. She was large, carrying packages, and her face was flushed with what looked like distress. Behind her, through the open door, he heard the sound of young women laughing. Elijah had witnessed cruelty often enough in his life to recognize it instantly. The young woman hurried past him, her eyes fixed on the ground, and he saw the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her packages. Something stirred in him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't pity exactly, it was recognition. He saw in her hunched shoulders and downcast eyes a pain that mirrored his own, though born of different circumstances. She was being pushed aside by the world, just as he had pushed himself aside. Without quite understanding why, Elijah found himself following her. Clara walked quickly, wanting to put distance between herself and the trading post. She didn't notice the tall man following some yards behind her until she reached the edge of town, where the road narrowed to a path leading toward her cabin. She glanced back, and her breath caught. The mountain man was there, walking steadily behind her. Fear jolted through her. She had heard stories about him, about how he lived like a savage in the wilderness. What did he want with her? She increased her pace, her packages bouncing awkwardly, but the man maintained his distance, neither closing the gap nor falling back. Clara's heart hammered. Should she run? Should she call out? But then she noticed something. He wasn't approaching her menacingly. He was simply walking. And when a group of men emerged from the blacksmith shop and began making crude gestures in her direction, the mountain man's presence seemed to make them think twice. They fell silent and turned away. Clara slowed, confused. Was he protecting her? She reached a fork in the path and paused, turning slightly to look at him. Elijah stopped as well, maintaining that same respectful distance. For a moment, their eyes met. He didn't smile or speak. He simply stood there, his gray eyes steady and calm. Then Clara turned and continued on her way, and Elijah followed. This pattern continued for the next several weeks. Whenever Clara came to town, Elijah seemed to materialize from somewhere and walk silently behind her. He never spoke to her, never came close enough to make her uncomfortable, but his presence created an invisible shield around her. The taunts diminished. The cruel laughter grew quieter. People seemed to think twice before mocking the large girl when the mountain man was nearby. Clara didn't understand it, but she found herself grateful. For the first time in years, she could walk through Harrow's Creek without her stomach twisting in dread. She began to look for him when she came to town, feeling a strange sense of disappointment when he wasn't there. One cold November morning, she finally gathered the courage to acknowledge him. As she left the trading post, she turned and found him standing by his horse, waiting. Their eyes met, and this time Clara did something she hadn't done in years. She smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and shy, but it transformed her face. Elijah felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking on a frozen river. He nodded once, a slight inclination of his head, and she saw the corners of his mouth move in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Then winter arrived in earnest, and Elijah disappeared into the mountains. The winter of 1793 was brutal. Snow fell thick and heavy, piling against cabin walls and making travel treacherous. Clara and her mother huddled by their fire, rationing their supplies and praying they would last until spring. Clara thought often of the mountain man during those long, dark months. She wondered if he was safe in his distant cabin, wondered if he was cold or hungry. She found herself missing his silent presence, the sense of safety he had provided. Her mother, when told about the man who had followed Clara through town, had been alarmed at first, but Clara assured her that he had never been threatening, only watchful, and gradually her mother had come to see it as a blessing. "Perhaps," she had said weakly, her illness making her voice thin, "God sends angels in unexpected forms." In late February, her mother's condition worsened. The cough that had plagued her for months deepened, and fever took hold. Clara did everything she could, brewing herbs into teas, keeping her warm, praying desperately. But on a frozen March morning, her mother slipped away peacefully, leaving Clara truly alone in the world. The town buried her mother in the small cemetery behind the church. A handful of people attended out of duty rather than affection. The minister spoke brief words, and then it was over. Clara stood by the fresh grave, numb with grief and uncertainty. What would she do now? How would she survive alone? As the sparse gathering dispersed, Clara became aware of a figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, partially obscured by snow-laden pines. Elijah. He had somehow known, somehow come down from the mountains despite the harsh weather. He didn't approach, didn't offer empty words of condolence. He simply stood there, a silent witness to her grief. And somehow that meant more than any words could have. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it brought an explosion of green life and rushing water from melting snow. Clara struggled to maintain her mother's cabin and garden alone. Her savings were nearly depleted, and work was scarce. The whispers in town had started again, now that she no longer had the mountain man's protective presence. One April morning, Clara woke to find a deer hanging from the tree in her yard, already dressed and ready to be butchered. She stared at it in confusion and wonder. Who would have left such a gift? But she knew. Somehow, she knew. Over the following weeks, more gifts appeared, a stack of split firewood, a bag of cornmeal left on her doorstep, fresh fish cleaned and ready to cook. She never saw him leave these things, but she knew they came from Elijah. Finally, one evening as the sun was setting, she heard footsteps approaching. Clara stepped outside to find Elijah standing in her yard, holding a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. For the first time, he had come openly, in full view. "For you," he said. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, but not unkind. Clara took the bundle with trembling hands and unwrapped it to find beautiful beaver pelts, soft and luxurious. She looked up at him with wide eyes. "I can't. This is too much." "Trade them," Elijah said simply. "They'll fetch good price, enough for supplies." Tears filled Clara's eyes. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you helping me?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her face, really looked at it, seeing past the flesh to the person beneath. "Because," he said slowly, "nobody should have to walk alone." "But you walk alone," Clara pointed out softly. "Yes," he agreed, "and I know how it feels." He turned to leave, but Clara found herself speaking before she could think. Would you like some supper? It's not much, but—" Elijah paused, surprised by the invitation. He should refuse. He should maintain his distance, but he found himself nodding instead. That evening, they sat across from each other at Clara's small table, eating venison stew she had made. At first, the silence was awkward, neither knowing what to say. But gradually, words began to flow. Clara spoke of her parents, her father's kindness and skill as a craftsman, her mother's gentle nature. She spoke of the loneliness she had endured, the cruelty of the town, her fears about the future. Elijah listened, and then haltingly he began to share his own story. He told her about his wife, Sarah, and their baby son, Thomas. He told her about the fever, the helplessness he had felt, the crushing grief that had driven him into the mountains. He spoke of the 5 years he had spent in solitude, believing he could outrun his pain. "But you can't outrun it," he said quietly. "It follows you everywhere." "No," Clara agreed, "but maybe you don't have to carry it alone." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding, a possibility. Spring turned to summer, and Elijah found himself making the journey down from his mountain cabin more frequently. At first, he told himself he was just checking on Clara, making sure she was managing. But the truth was simpler and more profound. He wanted to be near her. Clara, for her part, found herself waiting eagerly for his visits. She would see his tall figure emerging from the forest path and feel her heart lift. They would talk for hours, sometimes sitting on the porch, sometimes walking through the woods together. He taught her to identify animal tracks, to read the signs of changing weather. She shared with him her love of wildflowers, her dreams of having a real garden someday. The town noticed, of course. The whispers intensified. What could the mountain man possibly want with fat Clara Witmore? Was he simple-minded? Was it some kind of joke? One day at the trading post, Clara overheard Mrs. Hutchins speaking to a group of women. "It's unnatural," she was saying. "A man like that, strong and capable, wasting his time with her. Mark my words, he'll come to his senses soon enough." The words stung, but not as much as they once would have, because Clara knew something these women didn't. She knew that Elijah saw her, really saw her in a way no one else ever had. He didn't flinch from her size, didn't make jokes or cruel comments. When he looked at her, she felt beautiful, and Elijah was changing too. The constant sadness in his eyes was gradually lifting, replaced by something warmer. He smiled more often. He laughed at Clara's gentle humor. He found himself thinking about the future again, something he hadn't allowed himself to do in 5 years. One warm July evening, they sat by the creek near Clara's cabin, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Fireflies danced in the gathering dusk. "Clara," Elijah said, his voice suddenly serious, "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her heart suddenly racing. "What is it?" "When I first saw you last autumn, walking out of that trading post looking so hurt. Something woke up in me that I thought was dead. At first, I didn't understand it. I just knew I couldn't stand by and watch people treat you that way. Elijah, let me finish, he said gently. Over these months, getting to know you, talking with you, seeing your strength and your kindness despite everything you've endured. Clara, you brought me back to life, and I've realized something. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle around hers. I love you. Clara's breath caught. Tears spilled down her cheeks. How can you love me? She whispered. Look at me. I am looking at you, Elijah said firmly. I see a woman who has endured cruelty with grace, who cared for her sick mother with devotion, who has a kind heart and a strong spirit. I see a woman I want to spend my life with if she'll have me. But the town, to hell with the town, Elijah said fiercely. Their opinions mean nothing. Clara, I'm asking you to be my wife. We can leave here if you want, go somewhere new, or we can stay and face them together. I don't care, as long as I'm with you. Clara looked into his gray eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and love. For so many years, she had believed herself unworthy of such feelings. But Elijah had shown her differently. He had walked beside her when everyone else pushed her aside. He had chosen her when he could have chosen anyone. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Elijah smiled then, a true smile that transformed his whole face and pulled her into his arms. They held each other as the creek sang its endless song and the fireflies painted the darkness with tiny lights. They were married in late August by a traveling circuit preacher who happened through Harrow's Creek. The ceremony was simple, held in Clara's cabin with only a handful of witnesses, a few trappers who knew and respected Elijah, and one elderly neighbor woman who had always been kind to Clara. The town gossiped, of course, but Clara and Elijah paid them no mind. They had each other, and that was enough. Elijah moved his trapping operation closer to Clara's cabin, expanding it into a proper homestead. He built additions to the structure, creating a larger living space and a separate room for storing furs and equipment. Clara turned the surrounding land into a magnificent garden, growing vegetables and herbs and the wildflowers she loved. Together, they created something neither had thought possible, a home filled with peace and love. That first winter, as a married couple, they huddled together by the fire during storms, talking late into the night. Elijah taught Clara to tan leather and prepare furs. Clara taught Elijah to cook properly, to make bread and preserves. They laughed together, worked together, and supported each other through difficult days. Slowly, Clara began to change. It wasn't her body, though. She did grow stronger from the physical work of maintaining the homestead. It was something deeper. The shame that had weighed on her for so many years began to lift. She walked with her head high. She smiled freely. The constant tension she had carried in her shoulders released. Elijah changed too. The haunted look left his eyes. The guilt he had carried over his first family's deaths began to ease. He realized that loving Clara didn't dishonor Sarah's memory. Rather, it honored it by choosing to live fully again, to embrace the gift of a second chance. One spring morning, as they worked together planting the garden, Clara paused and placed her hand on her belly. Elijah looked at her questioningly. "I think," she said softly, "we're going to have a baby." Elijah froze, a mixture of joy and fear crossing his face. Clara understood. She reached out and took his hand. "I'm scared too," she admitted, "but we'll face it together." Elijah pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "Together," he echoed. In late autumn of 1795, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, but Clara's strength saw her through. When Elijah held his son for the first time, tears streamed down his face, tears of joy, grief, fear, and overwhelming love all mixed together. They named him Thomas, after Elijah's first son, and the healing that name brought was profound. It was an acknowledgment of the past, a way of carrying forward the memory, but also a declaration of new life and new hope. The cabin filled with new sounds, a baby's cry, a mother's lullaby, a father's gentle crooning. Clara, who had once believed herself unlovable and unworthy, discovered reserves of strength and tenderness she never knew she possessed. Elijah, who had run from life into the wilderness, found himself wholly present and engaged. When spring came again, Clara wrapped little Thomas warmly and walked with Elijah to the trading post. It was her first visit to town since before Thomas was born. She felt the old familiar nervousness rising, but pushed it down. She was a mother now, a wife, a woman with purpose and value. As they walked down the main street, people stared. The same people who had mocked her, excluded her, treated her as less than human. But this time, Clara didn't lower her eyes. She walked with her head high, her hand in Elijah's, their baby in her arms. And something surprising happened. Mrs. Hutchins, the trading post owner's wife, stepped forward. Her face was uncertain, almost ashamed. "Clara," she said quietly, may I see the baby?" Clara hesitated, then pulled back the blanket slightly. Mrs. Hutchins looked down at Thomas's peaceful, sleeping face, and her expression softened. "He's beautiful," she said. Then, meeting Clara's eyes, she added, "I'm sorry for how I treated you, how we all treated you. You didn't deserve that." It wasn't much, just a few words, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, other apologies came, some explicit, others implicit, in changed behavior. The young women who had once mocked Clara began to nod politely when they passed. Mothers asked her advice about caring for babies. The minister's wife stopped speaking of gluttony as a manifest sin. Not everyone changed, of course. Some continued to gossip and judge, but Clara found she no longer cared. She had something more valuable than their approval. She had love, family, and self-respect. In the summer of 1802, Clara stood in her garden, now lush and extensive, watching her 3 children play. Thomas, nearly 7, was teaching his younger sister Sarah, named for Elijah's first wife with Clara's blessing, how to identify rabbit tracks. Little Daniel, barely 2, toddled after them on unsteady legs. The cabin had grown even more over the years, expanded to accommodate their growing family. The homestead was prosperous, Elijah's trapping and hunting providing well, Clara's garden yielding abundant food. They had even acquired a cow and chickens. Clara herself had changed in ways both physical and spiritual. The hard work of homesteading had reshaped her body somewhat, but more importantly, it no longer defined her. She was strong, capable, and content. The pain of her past had faded to a distant memory, replaced by the richness of her present. Elijah emerged from the forest, a deer slung over his shoulders. At 45, he was still powerfully built, though his dark hair was now threaded with silver. He dropped the deer near the smokehouse and walked over to Clara, kissing her softly. "Good hunt?" she asked. "Good hunt," he confirmed. He looked at their children playing, and his face held such contentment that Clara felt her heart swell. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "When you first followed me through town?" Elijah was quiet for a moment, considering. "Every day," he said finally. "That was the day my life began again. That was the day I learned that walking beside someone, especially when the world pushes them aside, is the most important thing a person can do." Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching Thomas patiently show Sarah how to read the forest signs. "He's just like you," she observed. "He's like both of us," Elijah corrected. "He has your kindness, your patience, my stubbornness, perhaps." He smiled. "But most importantly, he's learning what we learned, that love means showing up, standing beside people, choosing them especially when it's not easy." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the family gathered for supper. They sat around the table Elijah had built, eating food from Clara's garden and meat from Elijah's hunt. Thomas told stories of his forest explorations, Sarah giggled at her father's jokes, and Daniel banged his spoon happily. After the children were tucked into bed, Clara and Elijah sat on the porch, as they did most evenings, watching the stars emerge. Elijah's arm was around Clara's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real," Clara said softly, "that I have all this, that I have you." "It's real," Elijah assured her, "and it's forever. You know what I learned in the mountains during all those years alone?" "What?" "That silence can be peaceful, but it can also be lonely. That surviving isn't the same as living, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to be present, to stand beside someone, to love openly despite pain and fear." Clara lifted her head to look at him. "When you followed me that day, did you ever imagine it would lead to all this?" Elijah smiled, that warm smile that still made her heart flutter after 9 years together. "No," he admitted. "I just knew I couldn't stand by and watch you hurt. I knew that walking beside you felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. Everything else, it was a gift I didn't know I was allowed to receive." "We were both pushed aside by the world," Clara reflected, "both alone in different ways. And then we found each other." "We chose each other," Elijah corrected gently, "and we keep choosing each other every day." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. From inside the cabin came the peaceful sound of children breathing in sleep. The creek sang its eternal song. Clara thought about the girl she had been, walking through Harrow's Creek with her head down, her heart heavy with shame and loneliness. She thought about how close she had come to believing the cruel words, to accepting that she was unworthy of love and happiness. And then she thought about the moment when everything changed. A silent mountain man choosing to walk beside her, not with words or grand gestures, but with simple, steadfast presence. That choice had saved her, and in saving her, she had saved him too. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Elijah asked. "For seeing me, for choosing me, for walking beside me when everyone else pushed me aside." Elijah tightened his arm around her. "Thank you for letting me, for teaching me that it's okay to live again, to love again, to be present instead of hiding." They sat together under the stars, two people who had found in each other a home, a haven, a second chance at life. The town of Harrow's Creek might never fully understand what drew them together, might never comprehend the depth of their connection. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was this: they had walked through darkness and found light. They had been pushed aside and chosen to stand beside each other, and in doing so, they had built something beautiful, lasting, and true. As the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across their homestead, Clara and Elijah sat in perfect peace. Behind them was pain and loneliness. Before them was a future filled with love, family, and endless possibilities. And beside each other, always, was exactly where they belonged.